This is Sirens, a not-so-new podcast brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. We are going to be sounding all the alarms on technology, governance, and national security issues, and most definitely luring some men to their deaths today. I'm Loren DeYoung-Shulman.
And I'm Radha Iyengar-Plum.
It takes us a minute to figure out that there's two of us. There's also you're waiting for the.
I know.
Simpson. Hi, Erin. Hi, Erin. We
miss
missed you. She's having an amazing trip this week, so I hope she's having a great time. Given that, so if you were in the Washington, D.C. area, and if you're on the Eastern Seaboard, you are well aware of the snow situation that we're having in this area, which introduced me to a new term, which is snowcrete.
Yeah.
But really raises the question of the week that I wanted to raise this week of what is your favorite / silliest snow in D.C. memory, Radha?
So I was thinking about trying to go back in time to Snowmageddon for those who remember it, and I was living on Capitol Hill in that time. But actually I realized my favorite memory is this snowstorm in which my children have, because it's not really snow, it's like a thick level layer of ice on top of previous snow, invented the term penguining, in which they just, at some point while walking on the streets that are covered in ice, just start laying on their bellies and wiggling side to side and propelling themselves down very gentle slopes and across Hillendale. And frankly, I love the idea of penguining, and it will fill me with joy for years to come.
If people have not heard Benedict Cumberbatch say the word
oh my God, penguin?
Yes, penguin. It's delightful. Also, last night I parked my car, which driving, why did I do that? And tried to walk through my alley, out the other side of my alley. And I should have just penguined. I would have been much happier. Everyone would have been safer. So this is definitely a Loren being mildly obnoxious in DC sort of memory. This is in 2009, whenever we had Snowmageddon. And this is in the middle of, I worked at the Department of Defense in the Secretary's office. It was in the middle of DOD producing the Quadrennial Defense Review.
Oh,
and we were trying to get the final document to review to the Secretary. But what that required is me actually looking at it. But we're all home. We don't have classified systems. It was a classified document, but it was still on controlled systems. And so somebody had printed it out, brought it home themselves, and marked it up and said okay, well, Loren needs this. So basically we made an agreement to sort of walk down, me from Adams Morgan, them up from U Street, and meet in the middle to hand over this huge QDR document. So in the middle of a snowstorm, I'm just walking around like I'm in the middle of a spy handoff. It was great. Just slowly trudge back to my house, only to find out part of the way through that the document I had, for whatever reason, was printed every other page. So I had pages 1, 3, 5, 7 of the QDR, which honestly I didn't notice until about page 10, and then realized this is starting to make not a lot of sense, and which tells you all you need to know about QDRs. Which, by the way, did you know that the Trump National Defense Strategy uses the word Trump 47 times?
I did hear about that.
Yeah, it's pretty delightful.
What a surprising coincidence that I'm sure was not at all on purpose.
What's great is I had told my students, before these things are released, people go through and see how many times words are in there. And then they had the Trump 47 times things, and it validated me as a professor. So thank you, Trump administration. Okay, so there is, we're recording on Tuesday night. There's lots going on, including just a few hours ago, there was some sort of deal that got through on actually funding government, which that's great. We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's start with the economy. Radha, what is going on with the economy, Fed rates, Fed chair, all the above?
Oh my goodness, so many things. Okay, let me start with the Fed. So the Fed held rates. Fed met January 29th and 30th. They kept rates unchanged. This wasn't a huge surprise. This will be Jerome Powell, the current Fed chair's last meeting, the FOMC, which he's the chair of, which sets the interest rates. And generally, I think he signaled the next move was unlikely to be a rate hike. So more or less, the markets don't expect any changes in interest rates till June. So that was all fine. Markets predicted. Powell gave a long speech on the importance of independent Fed at the same time that President Trump has nominated Fed Governor Kevin Warsh to replace Powell when his term ends in May. So the markets had a lot of feelings. Stocks were down, dollar and treasury yields were up, which mostly means people are fretting and want to put their money in safe things, largely because Warsh is seen as more politically accommodating, shall I say, on Trump and his demands, raising real and important questions on the independence of the Fed. So that's a whole storm brewing, especially as we head into the spring where we may expect additional inflationary pressures from tariffs. So let me just talk about tariffs for a second too, because
wait, hold up just a second before you talk about tariffs. I have like one Jerome Powell. I have a number of Jerome Powell memories, but like my first J. Powell memory is when they were considering him for being nominated as Fed chair. There was a couple of different folks in consideration because rumors get out, blah, blah, blah. And some of Powell's students or former students made a music video as a sort of like mockery stand-up of I'll be watching you. And and with Jay Powell as like, I don't know how that was so sending him up in some way. And this was, so it's funny to me because like I should have had this indicator, but like knowing Radha, this was my really strongest indicator that economists are really bizarre and we should just like watch them closely.
In economics grad school, it is a standard thing that the holiday parties involve skits where the graduate students do skits of their professors. And I will note when I was at LSE, I was subject to such skits because I am apparently a highly skittable person.
You are.
Yeah. So yes, I believe they would do a singing rendition. But I feel like they do that sort of thing in OSD policy at DoD too. So Loren, if you went back to your policy
100% do. They do. I have like a number of like weird OSD policy Valentines in my life. But anyway, okay. More importantly, trade taxes.
So the trade taxes. So we may have reached a deal with India. Which was just in the news today. And as always, the deals are always a little bit confusing because they're not exactly agreements. They're more like speeches or tweets or truths on the truth social. What do we call them? Truths. Yeah, sure. Love it. It's not Orwellian at all. But I actually read with real interest recent research that's coming out on who is paying tariff rates. Because this is the big question, right? Tariffs haven't really caused the level of inflation expected, and the question is why. And it looks like from recent research from economists at Harvard and Chicago that tariff rates that importers have paid are about half of the announced statutory rates, only about 14% relative to the 20% statutory, which actually, if you do the math there, explains why inflation came in only at about 2.7%, well below the 3+% that people thought. Now, that happened in part because business absorbed a huge amount of the tariffs, in part because businesses could use things like stockpiles that had been purchased at pre-tariff prices to defray or offset the cost of those tariffs. But, stocks dwindle. And so the question is really, what does this mean for the actual impact in 2026? And did we use up all of our buffer and expect to see sharp price increases? So on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, I'll just remind us that the Supreme Court is expected to rule soon on whether those tariffs are allowed at all, whether Trump has the authority. And if he does, and if the court rules against him, whether Trump would invoke other authorities like Section 122 and other national security exemption, emergency exemption authorities, which creates just a huge amount of uncertainty on what we would anticipate the tariff rates being. The last piece I'll note is that the tariffs, because businesses didn't pay as much tariffs because they figured out ways around them using their stockpiles, also generated a lot less revenue. So about $280 billion as compared to the hundreds of billions that Trump had planned, when he has spent, I'm going to say, about an order of magnitude more than we raised in tariffs, though claiming to fund them by tariffs on things like the Warrior dividend and Trump accounts for kids. So there's a little bit of a shell game going on what's happening with the revenues what revenues are actually coming in and what prices are going to be. So I think 2026 is certainly shaping up for a year of continued conversations on affordability.
This is not my topic for our cocktail. It's a Jill hour, but just noting this is similar. There's a lot of Trump policies that were implemented and are going to have 6-month, 12-month, longer term impacts. One of them that we haven't really talked about, but I'll just mention briefly, is the fact that a lot of the folks who took early resignation or the deferred resignation plan or the DERP or whatever we called it, they didn't actually leave government until the January 1st or December 31st. And so like that is only being felt like quite abruptly in one moment. So that 300,000 resignation number that we know from the last year or so doesn't include a lot of the folks who are leaving by that point in time. In addition to that, it takes a long time for like when you are, for example, overseeing a contract. The contract will probably go on pretty normally for a while. But if you left in the middle of that contract, partway through, things might start to get a little bit dicier. So it's we look for signals in terms of like the impact of this administration and expect them to happen immediately after announcement or so. But it tends to take a whole lot longer, and we don't have great ways of capturing exactly what that looks like. So I would love journalists to kind of pick up on that thread of exactly what you're talking about, the study, like how, when it takes a long time, how do we start capturing that over a while?
Yes. And I think it's interesting because so much was done in the early days in the Trump administration that will have this long tail, but unusually we will get to see it during the course of their administration. So that should be interesting. What else do you wish to chatter with us about?
So like earlier today, but not so much that I've actually read in detail, it appears that Congress has kept us from shutting down the government, or at least part of the government, for a while.
Ish.
Fingers crossed. Like this is Tuesday night. Who knows what will actually end up happening? But the thing that was interesting to me about, we talked to you guys about shutdowns so many times, was that are we starting to see the tiniest inklings of Congress realizing that, oh, they have appropriations power, and that's not just a lights on, lights off power. That is a true power of the purse policy lever power, by which I mean Congress, it seems, has managed to manage appropriations for most of government, except for the Department of Homeland Security, which is only extended by, from what I understand, just a week. And instead of a clean CR or anything else under consideration, a number of members are insisting on a whole lot of riders and funding conditions tied to how DHS actually operates and conducts immigration enforcement in particular. And that without agreement on those conditions, portions of DHS funding lapse, triggering a partial shutdown, which means not just things like ICE and CBP, but also Transportation Security Administration, FEMA, CISA, a whole lot of other things like that. And Congress arguing over what agencies are doing versus the dollars they are spending during a shutdown season is, I'm going to say abnormal, but it's been a minute since they've had this perspective. And I very much hope that they are recognizing the value that they have here. That this is not just a keeps the lights on conversation. This is what do those dollars actually do? And that is the oversight practices that they usually use around hearings and reports and angry letters and things like that, that's definitely a package. But dollars is really where it matters. When you hold Congress back or hold the executive branch back from actually spending the dollars, that's when you have impact. From what I understand, in my incredibly great source of Fed News Reddit, is that DHS and others are considering, if there is an actual shutdown of their services, just having everyone or almost everyone be accepted so they continue to work without pay for a long period of time, which, by the way, that's not actually a great idea. That's particularly not a great idea. Let's just note for a minute, if we wanted to have ICE and CBP operating without pay in the environment they're in right now. So I found this all to be fascinating, and that Congress is actually operating in this way, but also fascinating to think about the implications.
And it does seem like the ways in which we manage shutdowns are really, I was going to say evolving, but maybe devolving is the right word, actually, where we used to have these conversations about what was exempted and not, and trying to minimize the length of shutdowns. And increasingly, it seems like the question is more what's the maximum number of people you can get to work without pay as we continue to have sort of, I'll call them political shenanigans but in some cases, really meaningful political opposition to what's happening. So it certainly is a changing landscape on what appropriations even means or does at this point.
It related to that on a smaller scale. From what I understand, previously OMB and OPM guidance and also law was that federal employees would receive back pay after a shutdown, no matter what, whether they were furloughed or accepted or otherwise. Apparently, the guidance that is released by OMB and OPM towards this end, it's a long, frequently asked questions that we've minorly updated over and over again, but has tended to be fairly kind of thematically the same, has been updated to remove that so that it doesn't say that anymore. And instead it says that Congress has to actively pass a specific appropriation in order to allow for feds to get paid, which is, I'll just say right here, kind of like a technically true but always given thing, but appears to be an effort by the administration or in order to be more punitive to federal civil servants. So we'll see how that actually ends up in practice.
Wow, well, that's a cheery cocktail hour for everyone.
Indeed. Okay. We are going to do a dumpster fire that you're going to hear what we're going to talk about, and you're going to be like, none of those words are interesting to me, but I want to tell you these words are very interesting. So just like give it some credit here. We are going to talk about the Department of Education's higher education accreditation system, which try to say that 3 times fast. Department of Education, higher education accreditation system. There's just a lot of shins.
What I love in Sirens Prep is seeing what random esoteric aspect of governance and government rulemaking or process Loren is going to deliver to us. And then realizing that although it seems mundane and ridiculous, I actually care deeply about all of the things in it once I am like going through the prep. And so this is no exception to that rule. So thank you for the ever growing education.
Absolutely. Before I let you get started, I just want to note that part of what we're going to talk about here is the Department of Education negotiated rulemaking process in which they have set up a committee to do rulemaking. And the words that I just said there are the most amount of knowledge I have about how that process works. So just assume that it's education, blah, 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 ends up with new policy at a later point in time. And it's not exactly the same as a normal rulemaking process. And I apologize to all of my OIRA friends because I know that it's very important.
I mean, I love a good rulemaking process as much as the next girl, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, maybe to set the stage a little bit, in late January, the Department of Education launched this rulemaking process, which is really, you can think of it as a peer review system to determine which colleges qualify for federal student aid, right? So accreditation is a workaround. Congress didn't want the federal government deciding which colleges are good and what should count as a college. So it's outsourced that judgment to independent accrediting bodies, but those accreditors are then have to be recognized and regulated by the federal government. So it's a little bit of a pass-through operation, with the idea being that there is this initial step that sets up the committee to make the recommendations, but the Department of Education can have some can inject its views, shall we say. And so they have a particular approach in which they use the current accreditation regime, that is, how do colleges get accredited by these third-party entities, as a protectionist system to shield existing players. And their claim is that does things like increase costs, drives credential inflation, adds administrative bloat, and most critically, I think, in this administration, quote, promotes ideologically driven initiatives. So this is really, you can see this as part of this multi-pronged effort by the administration to reshape what higher education institutions can do and even what defines a higher education institution at all. So maybe, Loren, you could start by just helping us understand, how is the federal government involved in higher education? What are the levers it has, given that obviously they're not running these colleges?
Yeah. And what's interesting to me about this is like, this is one of those areas where this administration jumped in feet first, wholeheartedly into the higher education sphere in a way that I think a lot of people weren't shocked by, given like the prior criticisms of, but like they really showed an ability to use all the levers that they had and in a quite impactful way, as well to say effective way. So they obviously, federal government does not run higher education, there's not like a university of the federal government in any way. Well, actually, there is a USDA university, but I'll set that aside, or used to be. But it does run a whole lot of the pipes that they depend on for their own sustenance. They run student aid, civil rights enforcement, which is often a big deal in the administration of universities, and also huge deal federal research funding. And those are all, well, they're different entities in different ways. Particularly the federal research funding is a whole lot of different entities. So the Department of Education is like one of the biggest levers in this. They are the ones who are working this accreditation policy that we talked about, but they do all of this in really kind of not quite back channel, sidebar ways that don't directly say, university, you must do this, though President Trump himself has no problem with that, but in ways that very much influence how they execute their work day to day and manage their behavior and think about their incentives. Because if a school loses access to Pell Grants or other kinds of student aid, student loan, or grants, it can't function, just full stop. Like if it loses access to Pell Grants, not going to work. If it loses access to major grants, we have seen universities over the past year make huge changes in their operations in order to get that back and then be asked for more. So the federal government, when it wants to, can have a significant influence while not actually being in charge of this, which is, we'll talk about this a little bit. It's something I hadn't really thought about before in terms of, there's one thing to have independent academia, and Radha, I would be curious in your thoughts on this too. It's another thing to have a federal system that is saying, here's the ends by which we want all of our institutional learning and academic progress to go. And that's, when you start to think about it, really quite scary, as opposed to having a series of universities that can effectively do what they want based on the choices that students make.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is really different about the approach this administration has taken to levers, which is not dissimilar to other departments or agencies, is their willingness to combine the political and the governance decision. So saying the government should ensure appropriate access to civil rights law enforcement, research, appropriately distribute research funding, and serve as a certain steward of these public funds feels really different than trying to drive your big P political agenda with that. And certainly this administration has had an appetite for that. So in that context, then what is going on with this rule-making business? Like, what are they actually trying to do?
Yeah. So this is where I'm going to say some words, and then we're going to do the Charlie Brown blah, 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 blah noise around like what that means, and then talk to you about what it actually means. So Department of Education, which if you've worked in government, you have to distinguish between DOE, which is energy, versus ED, big capitals, which is ed. Department of Education has launched a negotiated rulemaking process to change how accreditors are recognized and what they are required to measure. That effectively means that they are appointing a group of people to help come up with recommendations about a thing. So the department has sway over the people that are putting it into this process. So as Radha was talking about earlier, accreditors are the ones that decide which schools qualify, or they set up a standard for schools, which helps the Department of Education adjudicate who qualifies for federal aid. And the department is the one who decides which accreditors count. So you can have a random accreditor that like nobody actually wants to pay attention to, but the department can say, you're good, you're bad, here's who we want to listen to. So by changing the rules for recognition of these are the accreditors that we're interested in, the department can effectively redefine what is a quality education mean? Like, what is it? What is valuable? Where is it that is worth investing your time and dollars? Where is it we are going to recommend that students spend their time? And they have talked about a range of different options around like what they are interested in. The Department of Education right now has talked about a range of different options that they're interested in. And are opening the door for new accreditors or state-based accreditors, and have been interested in things like less traditional peer review inputs, more emphasis on student outcomes and earnings, things that actually, when you look at them on the surface, you're like, huh, that's not necessarily bad. Those are interesting things to pay attention to. There are other things that are maybe less palatable that they are seeking in terms of how, like, the sort of diversity of scholarship that you see at different universities, or the difference at diversity of perspective you see at universities, and other things that like may be Trojan horses for other elements. And it's also a bit fuzzy about the kinds of outcomes that they're actually seeking. But so there's good possibilities here, but there's also things that open up a whole lot of risk.
If that's the case, then are there, I mean, feels like maybe there's actual space here for trying to drive meaningful changes, for actually trying to do some long-term improvement. So where does that sit with what they're trying to do? And I guess both, what are the risks, but what are the potential upsides or legitimate critiques they're addressing, or kind of how can we think about this?
Oh yeah. So like you can find, I mean, I think there's not many people in America who are like, oh yeah, I'm totally a fan of how higher education is running right now, both based on cost, based on student experience, based on outcomes, like any number of things that people can find critiques in. And the Department of Education is, like, on a bipartisan basis, has been criticized for a long time for not holding higher ed to higher standards, having consistent standards. And they've gone about this in different ways. Some of the critiques that you have seen before have been, like, frankly, relying on pretty fuzzy standards of quality, at the higher costs and the much higher debt burdens. Schools with really bad completion rates will keep accreditation for years. People may remember, like, several years ago, there being a number of scandals around for-profit schools that were taking advantage, quite specifically, of veterans, and how long the Department of Education continued to support them in some ways. So universities, like, they are not the hero in this story, or at least not like in a way that everyone feels good and warm and fuzzy about. They've got a lot of challenges that people have wanted to use the accreditation system to take on for a long period of time. And the department is tapping into those critiques, understandably so, in order to justify reform. And people are, I think there's good reasons to look at what might they do that could be valuable. But it's also, like, it's a lot. You see this consistently in other parts of this administration's perspective, where they are using existing and justified critiques in order to open up risks for saying that just because maybe we don't like the value system of your university president, or maybe we don't like the fact that you have gender in your curriculum in some way, are those elements of accreditation in ways that are going to end up being deeply harmful to schools' ability to stay open and ability to, like, invite students in.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like this is, I don't know, robbing Peter to pay Paul is probably not exactly the right analogy, but it is taking a system that has already had some fissures and fractures in it and taking advantage of them to push an ideological agenda more than it is trying to shore up and create more objective and being more, I guess what I worry is the two things you really want from universities are sort of intellectual independence to really provide that free market thinking and free speech, and then, like, actual quality support for students. And this doesn't seem to solve either of those problems. So how are the universities reacting? Are they, do they have are they manning the battlements and fighting back, or rolling over, or what does this look like?
So personal view is that I have not loved how universities have reacted to the Trump administration overall, because it has seemed in general short-sighted and self-serving in ways that are not about their mission, but much more about their long-term proclivities for sustainability. I think they will fight back on this. Because this is a very, very bread and butter element for them. Like, this new rule just came out and had generated a fairly vociferous set of responses in the usual places there. There are some other places that you see universities pushing back in terms of academic freedom overall. I don't think we have consistently seen, I'd love your perspective here too, on the elements of federal policy that have addressed DEI offices or programming at universities or anything that's sort of like downstream of that. They likewise around funding. It's been like you've seen some universities push back quite hard and others kind of negotiate and roll over in order to get funding, in order to have to give more funding. It's things that I don't totally understand. And protests in particular, like I see like universities are more than happy, not all, but many of them are more than happy to be like, oh yeah, those student protesters, those guys are super annoying. Like we'll totally like roll over and like allow them to take the hit in some ways. And the Trump administration has done like a lot across all of these spaces. They've had a fairly, I mean, in terms of having a strategic plan, they've got a pretty big plan here in terms of pursuing civil rights investigations, investigations on campus speech, like whether or not the campuses failed to protect Jewish and Muslim students from harassment, threats to remove or recondition research funding, and just their overall bully pulpit. And universities it's been just really interesting to watch. So I just feel like they have not grasped the situation that they are in terms of their overall, like where their overall positioning, and the where they have pushed back has been inconsistent with where I think their actual survivability rates are. So like I'm curious about your views, but Jellic, as somebody who's like not a higher ed person, I'm just like watching this, like, do you want to keep doing your work you're doing? Like, what's going on here?
So I too have been disappointed and also surprised. And you see this in a number of institutions. I thought it about law firms. I think about universities, right? There are groups that don't have a lot of power or influence and would find it hard to drive it, right? You can see how immigrant communities they're increasingly organized, especially with allies, but you could see how, marginalized groups, trans community groups, right, aren't going to have the resources to fight back. But universities, especially in the collective, really do. And so it has surprised me how long we have remained in the appeasement mode instead of in the unified oppose every incursion mode. And I agree. I think, we're starting to get there. I don't think DEI had the bite, but I think you saw a little bit of this in federal funding. And I think going after it on accreditation takes that one click higher. And so, it'll be interesting to see if this puts a little bit more oomph in their opposition to force the process to really reform around non-ideological elements aimed at ensuring intellectual freedom and student well-being rather than on particular political modalities or profit margins.
I mean, the thing that this is one of the things like I was putting together notes on this that just like was striking to me as I wrote it. Like, okay, so like I think every university in the country does not necessarily do the greatest possible job. They're doing a whole lot of different sorts of jobs. They're doing interesting jobs. But do I actually want the entire higher education system to just become executives of federal will, of executive power? Like executive power is shaping and driving what our higher education system is. And I think it can provide incentives. And often we talk about at the federal level, what are the incentives that we want to set? And like, can we help incentivize that in terms of student choices and where different things are funded and different programs that we set? But if like every single college was just, here's what the president of the United States wants people to learn about and study, that just seems like, wow, that's a lot, and also kind of insane and ridiculous, particularly to Radha's point, when you have so many incredibly powerful institutions that have the ability to push back on this and have only done so in some limited spurts and starts. And this is a little snarky, but as I see many academics who study this sort of work standing up and saying, like, here's how this regime is doing all the terrible and wrong and bad things. And then you see the institutions that they work at just roll over in some ways. The discontinuity is it is fascinating in a like, holy shit sort of way, but also deeply disheartening in a I live here sort of way. All right, so this week, for warning signs. We wanted to talk about some themes that we are seeing around the Department of Homeland Security, some of its operations, but more importantly, its origin stories and future. And what are folks thinking about the authorities, the reach, and the limitations on the department? So just to set up for context, because this opens up, it's like so many rabbit holes. DHS launched what it calls the largest immigration operation ever in Minnesota earlier this month, deploying about 2,000 agents to the Twin Cities and beyond. And what began as just an extension of federal presence, because it was already there, has very much escalated into a series of not just constitutional crises, but I would say civic crises at the intersection of immigration enforcement, federalism, and civil rights. And there's a piece of this that is like a numbers story that is its own fascinating and somewhat horrifying moment, that there have been over 1,000 arrests in a few weeks. But there are a lot of big picture legal, constitutional, and just like, what do we think about America? Questions that run a little bit deeper than that. We have seen DHS agents have conduct warrantless home entries, a practice that was apparently authorized sometimes last year, but we've seen more, at least in my mind, more of an aggressive version of this. And then, of course, most unfortunately, our listeners will be familiar with the federal agents killing 2 people, Renee Good and Alex Prete. This has prompted questions, like there's so many questions we could go down, but I think one big one we want to explore today is what this federal presence means, not just for Minnesota, but Illinois and other parts of the country have filed lawsuits against DHS, are alleging that it violated the 10th Amendment by commandeering state resources and exceeding constitutional authorities. And the administration is claiming federal immunity for ICE officers, which is fascinating. But it's not just about immigration policy. There's a lot of threads here that relate to oversight, compliance, civil liberties, and the role of federal law enforcement operations. So there was one person I immediately thought of that can help us dig into, at least scratch the surface of some of these issues. And that is my former colleague, Carrie Cordero. She is the Robert M. Gates Senior Fellow and General Counsel at the Center for a New American Security, and has been focused on this topic, on the role of DHS, the authorities, and what it means for America for so long. So welcome so much, Carrie. We're really excited to have you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the invitation to join you.
So I'm going to start with a baseline question that could take us 4 hours, but we'll start as best we can. When federal agencies like ICE or the FBI or DEA or others, they operate in American communities, what is, I would say, proper, reasonable, responsible federal to state law enforcement coordination look like? Are there practices that should go around that for information sharing or operational planning, or even just like basic respect for local authorities?
So there's some foundational, basic constitutional rights that law enforcement officers generally, so to just speaking at a very, very general level, that law enforcement officers need to follow. And normally we would expect are properly and routinely trained on those issues. So basic Fourth Amendment training, for example, understanding of what the Fourth Amendment requires, that there needs to be probable cause to search a residence or search a car or arrest a person, that probable cause finding needs to also be approved by a neutral magistrate, like really Fourth Amendment 101 type issues that I think are sort of top of mind actually in some of the analysis of what we're seeing in terms of the activities of ICE and DHS agents more broadly in these recent deployments. So, generally, whether it's federal or state or local law enforcement, they have fundamental training, fundamental standards for hiring, different across different agencies in terms of the standards and the training practices. But there are sort of foundational constitutional and legal requirements that all federal and state and local law enforcement personnel are expected to engage in and be trained in and be prepared for in situations. And In addition to the Fourth Amendment, there's obviously First Amendment issues and people's right to protest, people's right to peaceably assemble, people's right to engage in religious practice. And law enforcement personnel are generally in the position of protecting those individuals in their engagement in their rights. So one of the interesting dynamics that I think we're seeing is this in the political rhetoric surrounding Minneapolis in particular, is sort of this presentation as if protesters are countering law enforcement activities in the engagement of their First Amendment activities, when, as a general matter, law enforcement's job is to, among other things, protect individuals when they are engaging in their First Amendment rights. And I think that fundamental premise has gotten lost a little bit in the political rhetoric surrounding the recent events.
Just to build on that in terms of like what has made Minnesota abnormal, the Minnesota operations, both operationally and legally abnormal. I think there's been a lot that we've seen in headlines, but with the context of, again, you've got 2,000 federal agents deployed, which seems like a lot to me. And my questions are related to like the way that they're coordinating with local law enforcement, how that is creating chaos or impact on the ground. So to what degree that this is usual or unusual, and also if there's any kind of nuances or trends that we see as compared to Los Angeles or Portland or some of the major deployments we've seen this year.
Yeah. So first, I think it's important to make the foundational point that law enforcement, like just at a really, really general level, federal, state, local, like they do their work every single day cooperating with one another on just a huge range of issues. In criminal investigations all around the country, whether it's violent crime, whether it's white collar crime, whether it's national security related, much work cannot get done unless there is cooperation between federal law enforcement and state and locals. DHS is an organization that in its relatively short history of about 20 years has been responsible for fostering that cooperation and facilitating information sharing and creating forums for state and local and federal law enforcement personnel to work collaboratively. An example of a cooperative arrangement that's existed very successfully for many years has been the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, which are longstanding task forces that reside in FBI offices all around the country, but are task forces made up of both FBI agents, representatives from other federal government law enforcement agencies, and immigration officers, and state and local law enforcement. So the concept of law enforcement partnership and cooperation is really fundamental to law enforcement and the way that it operates in this country. Why Minnesota, to get to your question of why Minnesota has emerged as such an anomaly, I think in part goes to the volume of DHS, the sheer numbers of DHS personnel who have been deployed to that region, comparable to the local law enforcement personnel and comparable to like the size of the city and the number of, I guess I'll say, targets for enforcement, for immigration enforcement operations that exist. And so I'm not in Minnesota. I haven't been to Minneapolis, but from the reporting that I observe, it looks like there is a disproportionate amount of DHS federal law enforcement presence in comparison to the size and scope of the city and the local and state law enforcement personnel that are there. The other reason that I think is the major differentiator is the tactics. And the tactics are, first of all, we can all see them. because there is so much video evidence available. So they're not so in dispute because there is such prevalent video evidence of how DHS officers and agents are behaving on the streets. And I would say most law enforcement observers, I think it's fair to say, observe these videos and observe what we're seeing for how the DHS personnel, and I say DHS because it's a nice enforcement operation, but it appears that there's been a lot of Border Patrol or Customs and Border Patrol personnel who are supplementing those activities from elsewhere in the department. And they are operating in ways that are unfamiliar to anyone who is part of the law enforcement professional community, pulling people out of cars, shooting at moving cars, physically assaulting or interacting with citizens who are protesting, maybe getting in their face some, but engaging in protest activity. And some of the activities that we're seeing on these videos are just inconsistent with basic law enforcement professionalism. The other thing that I would say, just with respect to the shootings and the allegations and sort of the defense that some of the administration arguments have made in terms of, well, some of the protesters are, they're getting in the face of agents, or they're physically getting too close to agents, or they're impeding their operations. And a point I would just like to underscore is that the remedy for that is arrest. Arrest, not physical violence, certainly not lethal force. And so any defenses of the use of lethal force that are along the lines of, well, this individual was agitating, or this individual was getting in the way of operations, or this individual was obstructing our legitimate law enforcement activity, the remedy for that is that the person would be arrested. And then if there is sufficient evidence to charge them, that they be charged criminally. But the remedy under US law and under the practices of law enforcement is not the use of lethal force.
So juxtaposing the tactics that you're describing as against the administration's statement that it's claiming federal immunity for the DHS officials, ICE officers, and others on the ground under the Supremacy Clause. So I want you to nerd out for a minute and walk through what is the Supremacy Clause actually meant to protect versus what it doesn't, and then to kind of move a little bit more into an oversight conversation. The Congress has reacted a fair amount to all of this, but in particular on this point, how should they be thinking about balancing the role of federal enforcement authority versus the need for accountability that we're seeing at this moment? Because it is an important point to protect, but I think that the tactics being used right now, at least like my supposition, is that like they do not fall into those protected spaces.
Yeah. So, So just quickly on sort of the supremacy issue. So the Supremacy Clause, which is, in the Constitution, and what it basically says is that federal law is the supreme law of the land. It's the provision that enables decisions that are made by the Supreme Court binding on state courts. So we do have a legal system in this country where laws can be challenged, and if they go up to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court makes a decision, then that is binding on the whole country. Individual states can't accept themselves out of it. Supremacy Clause, it enables state laws to be overturned. It enables Congress to be able to, if it passes specific legislation intended to preempt state laws, it can do that. It doesn't automatically mean that state law is irrelevant, but I think the reason it has become sort of part of the conversation is that we do have federal immigration laws, and DHS is lawfully authorized to effectuate them. And I think that's, moving us into more of the reform conversation that I know you want to have, Lauren, and the proposals that are in Congress or other proposals that have been made in the policy space. Once Congress moves beyond this immediate consideration of the ICE and DH budget, part of the reason that I think the existence of immigration law and the supremacy clause is part of the conversation is because we do have these immigration laws on the books. And so whether or not people as a policy matter disagree with the administration's pivot towards enforcing the immigration laws and proceeding with these deportation proceedings against people who are not violent criminals or are law-abiding individuals with presence in the United States, or their enforcement activities are more broad than just targeting people who pose a national security or a violent crime type threat, is the immigration laws currently permit enforcement across the board for individuals who are not authorized to be in the country. And unless that is changed and there is more comprehensive immigration reform or change to the immigration law across the board, DHS and the administration will continue to be able to rightly say that they are authorized to enforce the immigration laws.
So maybe unpacking that a little bit, because it seems like there are a couple of different pieces that you were starting to tease at there. One is thinking about DHS as the executive branch arm to enforce these laws in context. And of course, DHS, I think as Loren mentioned in the beginning, is really a relatively new department. It was created post 9/11. It consolidated a number of agencies. There are now sort of questions about whether this institutional structure is working and how we think about the enforcement arm of ICE and what their protocols are versus Border Patrol. So there's the DHS of it all. There's also then the question of, even within that structure and enforcement, there is appropriate oversight that can and should exist, both from the courts on whether the execution of those enforcement activities is lawful and constitutionally permitted, and then by Congress on just whether the general behavior and accountability mechanisms are there. So I wonder if you could help us sort of walk through a little bit how much of what we're seeing is a newish department or agency with a big high profile mission now that has gaps in statutory mission and clarity. Are we missing the congressional oversight? Is it lack of will? Are there particular mechanisms that would better enable that kind of oversight? Sort of help us walk through a couple of the pieces.
Sure. So I think what we're seeing right now, particularly with the aggressive uses of force in Minnesota is two things. Number one, as I mentioned before, it's the way in which DHS is choosing to use its authorities through these very, I'll say heavy-handed is the best way to describe them. Obviously, the uses of lethal force are more than that. But I think it's the way that they're going about it is part of the problem of what is actually happening on the ground. But how are they able to do it in that way gets to the structural issues within DHS. And, these issues draw on actually sort of two projects that we have run over here at the Center for New American Security. One was a project that we ran on DHS oversight and accountability specifically. And we put out a report in 2020 that highlighted why the Department of Homeland Security in particular could be susceptible to political influence, political manipulation, and its law enforcement capacity in a way that maybe other departments wouldn't so much. And Radha, those do get to some of the structural issues within DHS, the fact that it was many agencies put together all under one umbrella with a secretary whose legal authorities are perhaps inadequate in terms of being able to direct and control the components within the department. Certainly without adequate congressional oversight, it is a well-known and long-standing flaw in the congressional oversight of DHS that there are, I think at this point, over 100 different committees that the components of DHS report to. And so it has made the job of the Homeland Security committees in particular very, very difficult to be able to conduct effective oversight over the activities. It has to do with the fact that it's DHS that is actually the largest law enforcement department in the federal government. It's not the Department of Justice anymore, with the FBI and the DEA and the ATF and prisons and other components. It's the Department of Homeland Security, and the Secretary of Homeland Security is the leader of the largest law enforcement capacity. And yet there is not sufficient statutory mandates, for example, to have a robust Office of Civil Liberties and Civil Rights, which has been pretty much gutted under the current administration. It still exists on paper and in sort of a skeleton form, I understand, but not in a robust and meaningful capacity. And so the combination of that large law enforcement capacity, the strength of the component heads as compared to a secretary, the lack of sort of statutory requirements for activities of offices that would engage in making sure that the department has adequate policies and practices and trainings when it comes to civil liberties and civil rights. Like all of those things together create the soup that then makes up what we're seeing.
So maybe to close this out here, if you could wave a magic wand and get Congress to act now, which I recognize a lot of supposition is going into that, what are the specific reforms that you would want? What would you recommend they do to really help kind of get after these in a sort of statutory reform and clarity on mission sort of sense?
So I have both short-term and long-term things. I think there's a few things, and we'll see what happens in this current budget conversation. But if I was to wave a magic wand, there would be a few sort of core requirements that I would want made, and that there potentially could be bipartisan interest in to address some of the most a few of the aspects that I think are contributing to the current acute problem. One would be statutorily requiring that agents be identified, that they not wear masks. I think that there is just sort of a human component that goes to that in terms of behavior, that if a person is visible to the citizens that they are interacting with and the people that they are interacting with, that they will behave in a different way. And I think there's a fundamental transparency in a democracy that lends towards not having masked law enforcement personnel out on the streets. I think Congress should correct the ability of Border Patrol to operate in the interior. So over the years, there's been an interpretation that the Border Patrol can operate within 100 miles of the border. But if you look at a map, that's not Minneapolis. And that's not Charlotte and other parts of the country where Border Patrol has been supplementing ICE activities. But I think Congress should correct the ability of Border Patrol to operate in the interior, and they should be on the border where they have meaningful responsibilities and where they are trained and better prepared to operate. And then I think there's some basic training and qualifications for federal agents that could be implemented. So that's what I would do in the short term. In the long term, it has been my view for many years, having done the research and policy engagement at CNAS on these issues, that the statutory mission of the department should be overhauled. It was created in the post 9/11 environment. Most of the statutory priorities of the department on paper in the law pertain to counterterrorism, but that's not the bulk of what it does anymore. And it hasn't been actually for quite some time. If I was to redesign the department, I would focus it on the safety and security issues that I think are affecting Americans most in their lives, which is issues primarily pertaining to emergency management and FEMA, which is unfortunately an area that the current administration seems to be drawing down on. But I think that actually would be an area that would really best serve the country across a variety of issues if it was focused on natural disasters and emergency type events and providing services and assistance to state and locals. DHS is a huge grant making organization, so maintaining and facilitating that grant making to state and locals, law enforcement, governments, faith organizations is a really important part of what they do. Cybersecurity, and then there always is counterterrorism. And even though we're well past the 9/11 era, international terrorism organizations are still around and rear themselves in different ways from time to time. So I would redesign the statutory framework for the department, and then I think there's a lot of statutory changes that need to be made to bake into law the oversight and accountability mechanisms that we were talking about before.
This has been one of the things in following Carrie's work for a few years now that has always been fascinating to me is the origin stories of the department do not match up with, or do not at this point or fully match up with the original mission. Some of those things got changed. But even so, the 22 agencies that have been kludged together as part of the Department of Homeland Security are a mismatch also for the needs of Americans, the actual money out the door that DHS does on a regular basis, and what you might have in your head of what you think Homeland Security does if you just went through it. So I think that there's lots of different ways to think about reimagining DHS, but even just that basic linkage between what does an Americans really need and value in terms of security, what are the authorities of DHS, and what are the resources of DHS. It's just starting from that basic premise is a very different place than we are right now and deserves the attention that Carrie and other colleagues have been giving to it. If you are nerding out on these issues as much as I have over the years in this conversation, I definitely recommend checking out Carrie's work at CNAS and also her Substack, the Law Hour. This has been skimming the tops of a very fascinating conversation. I wish we could go on for much longer, but really, really appreciate you joining us this week and look forward to digging into more of your work in the future.
Great. Thank you so much.
Since we have used all of the nerdy words, accreditation, negotiated rulemaking, higher education, all in one body in order to think about where the federal government manages to have levers and access and all this crazy stuff, we are now going to go to Gong Show and talk about a question I love, which is, what is your favorite wintry book?
So I don't know if I would exactly classify this as my favorite book, but it is, I'm going to go with Little Women here. And
that's a great one.
A book right now called Beth is Dead, which is a modern retelling of Little Women in which Beth is murdered.
Okay.
And they have to solve her murder because the police suck, basically. And it is all set around a New Year's Eve party where Beth is found dead. And in reading this book, I was going back to Little Women, which of course I have a long worn and well-loved copy of, to see how the book's timeline lines up with the set of events in the novel. And man, both are fun times, and recommend original Little Women and Beth is Dead.
That's a great one. Okay, so I remember going to see Little Women. What are the most recent one that came out in the theaters that has
Emma Watson and
yep. And so the two girlfriends, and we're sitting there, and when Beth dies, one of them is just sobbing, and we leave, and we're like, oh god, yeah, it was terrible when Beth died, and one of them said, like, yeah, I had, like, I was just so surprised. I'm like, you were surprised that Beth died? And I realized that she had not read Little Women before. And it was a deep shock to her that Beth died. And that it is actually quite traumatic. I have a lot of wintry favorite books. I will mention one that I only read as an adult and I wish I'd read as a kid, which is called Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. It's a kid's fantasy novel where it's, everybody's dream, where you are actually like the secret great whatever grandson of King Arthur, and you have special powers, and you're going to go defeat all the bad things. And it takes place just before Christmas in the UK, and it snows a lot, and there's a lot of mysterious things, and a lot of like holiday food and wonderful things. And also people randomly go to this party at a castle. It's just great. I love that
party
style
at a castle.
And then similarly, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Or it becomes spring, obviously, when you have like everything is wintry at some points. But I love Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Great book. All right. Well, thank you for giving your time to talk about the Department of Homeland Security, higher education, accreditation, and all of the joy that is Sirens. We will see you next time.
Bye.